She said I couldn't do better, then smirked while sitting on another guy's lap. They told me she was a prize I didn't deserve, but the moment I saw her smirking on another man's lap, I realized the math never added up. I wasn't the problem in the equation. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Noah, and I am 26 years old. For the better part of 3 years, my life operated on a schedule dictated entirely by her whims. It was a suffocating existence, wrapped in the guise of a dream relationship that everyone on the outside seemed to admire. I was the guy who had won the lottery, or so said my friends, my colleagues, and even strangers who would see us walking down the street. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and demanded attention without speaking a word, a gravitational pull that I foolishly believed I was lucky to be anchored to. But looking back now, with the clarity that only distance and heartbreak can provide, I see it for what it really was. It wasn't love, it was occupancy. I was merely a placeholder in a life that was always meant for something bigger, or at least something louder. The dynamic was simple and insidious. She held the remote control to my self-esteem, turning the volume down on my achievements and turning it up on my flaws. If I got a promotion at work, it was a cute coincidence, but if I forgot to pick up her dry cleaning, it was a character defect that required a 3-hour summit meeting. Our social circle, a group of people I had once considered close friends, reinforced this hierarchy. They would laugh off her insults as just her being fierce and nudge me in the ribs whenever she would openly flirt with other men, telling me I was a lucky dog to be with a woman who was so in demand. I absorbed it all, drinking the poison like it was fine wine, convinced that her affection was a scarce resource I had to earn through subservience. I remember the specific moment the foundation began to crack, though I didn't realize it at the time. We were at a rooftop bar in the city, celebrating the anniversary of the day we met. I had booked a table weeks in advance, purchased a dress I knew she had been eyeing, and prepared a speech that was equal parts gratitude and devotion. She spent the entire evening on her phone, her back turned to me, scrolling through social media or texting God knows who. When the waiter brought out the dessert I had arranged, a chocolate lava cake with a candle, she didn't even look up. She just waved a manicured hand in the air, dismissing the gesture without a word. The silence at the table was heavy, but I sat there, swallowing the lump in my throat, blowing out the candle myself while she laughed at something on her screen. It was the look of pity from the waiter that did it. He saw the dynamic clearly, seeing me as a sucker and her as a user. That night, lying in bed next to her while she slept peacefully, unburdened by guilt or awareness, I stared at the ceiling and felt a hollowness in my chest. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad. I was just existing. I was a prop in her movie, a piece of furniture she could rearrange or discard whenever the mood struck her. The warning signs were there, flashing in neon red lights, but I had trained myself to be colorblind to her faults. I thought if I just loved her harder, if I just became more indispensable, she would eventually see my value. I didn't know yet that the value she saw in me was strictly utilitarian. A doormat is valuable because you wipe your feet on it, not because you admire it. This was the state of my life when the bet was placed. It wasn't a formal wager with money or contracts, but a verbal agreement made in the corner of a loud dive bar during a night out with the boys. One of them, fueled by cheap beer and misguided camaraderie, slapped me on the back and told me that I had hit the ceiling with her. He said that she was the best I would ever get and that I should just put a ring on it before she realized she could do better. They laughed, clinking their glasses, and I sat there with a weak smile on my face, nodding along. I believed them. I truly believed that she was the apex of my romantic life. I didn't know that in less than 48 hours, my entire world would be shattered. Not by losing her, but by finally seeing her for who she really was. The illusion was about to break, and the pieces were going to cut deep. The following day was a Friday, and the air in the office was thick with the anticipation of the weekend. I had spent the morning working on a proposal for a new client, a project that required a level of focus I usually reserve for defusing bombs. I was trying to distract myself from the gnawing feeling of inadequacy that the previous night's conversation had planted in my brain. My phone sat on the corner of my desk, a black mirror that remained ominously silent. She hadn't texted me good morning, a small ritual that usually happened, if only out of habit. The silence wasn't unusual. She often went silent when she was bored, but combined with the events of the dinner, it felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Around noon, I received a text message that broke the monotony. It wasn't from her, but from her best friend, a woman who had always looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and disdain. The message was brief and cryptic, telling me that I should stop by her apartment around 8 that evening. She said there was something important I needed to see, something that involved my girlfriend and a few other people. My stomach immediately dropped. I typed back a response asking for details, but the reply was instant. Just trust me. You need to see this with your own eyes. Don't knock, just walk in. The door will be unlocked. It was a setup, clearly. I debated ignoring it, chalking it up to drama or a prank, but the curiosity was a worm that burrowed deep into my mind. Why would a friend reach out to me? What could possibly be so important that it required a covert mission into my own girlfriend's apartment? I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions of my job while my mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. Was she throwing me a surprise party? It was unlikely, given her general disdain for effort, but maybe she had listened to my complaints. Maybe she was planning to finally apologize for the dinner, to turn a new leaf. Or maybe the darker voice in the back of my head whispered it was a trap. I tried to focus on the logical explanation. The friend was trying to help. Maybe she had seen something I hadn't. Maybe she was tired of watching her friend treat me like a second-class citizen. I clung to that hope, desperate to believe that there was someone in our orbit who actually cared about my feelings. I left work early, driving through the city as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange. The traffic was a nightmare, giving me too much time to sit with my anxiety. I turned off the radio, needing silence to think. I remember the conversation at the bar, the guys telling me I couldn't do better. It rang in my ears, a mocking chorus. I felt a strange determination build up inside me. I wasn't going there to fight, and I wasn't going there to beg. I was going there to face whatever reality was waiting for me. I felt like a soldier walking into a battle he knew he couldn't win, armed with nothing but his dignity. I parked 2 blocks away from her apartment complex, a high-end building that I paid a portion of the rent for despite barely staying there myself. The walk was cold, the wind biting at my face. I stood in front of the building for a long moment, looking up at the window of her apartment. The lights were on, casting a warm glow against the darkening sky. I could see shadows moving against the blinds, silhouettes of people mingling, drinks in hand. It looked like a party, a gathering. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a deep breath, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the entrance. The doorman nodded at me, recognizing me as the tenant's boyfriend, and held the door open. I stepped into the lobby, the smell of expensive perfume and floor wax filling my nose. The elevator ride up to the 20th floor felt like an ascent to the gallows. When the doors dinged open, the hallway was silent, a stark contrast to the muffled bass of music thumping from behind her door. This was it, the moment of truth. I reached for the handle, finding it unlocked just as the friend had promised, and turned it. The door swung open silently, well-oiled and maintained by the building's staff, revealing the living room bathed in the strobe-like chaos of a private party. The music was loud, a heavy bass track that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my shoes. The room was packed with people, most of whom I recognized vaguely from the periphery of her social life. Acquaintances, colleagues, hangers-on who were drawn to her orbit like moths to a flame. They held red cups and champagne flutes, their laughter blending into a cacophony of indifference. I stood in the doorway for a moment, invisible, a ghost haunting his own relationship. I scanned the room, looking for her face, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It didn't take long to find her. She was the center of gravity in the room, seated on a large velvet sofa that dominated the center of the living space. But she wasn't alone. Perched comfortably on her lap was a man I didn't recognize, a guy who looked like he stepped out of a catalog for overpriced streetwear. He had his arms draped lazily around her neck, and she was leaning back into him, her hand resting on his thigh. The sight was jarring, a physical blow that knocked the wind out of me. But what truly froze the blood in my veins was her expression. As she turned her head, presumably sensing a shift in the room's energy, or perhaps just looking for the next source of amusement, her eyes locked onto mine. She didn't jump up. She didn't look guilty. She didn't push him away. Instead, the corners of her mouth curled upward into a smirk. It was a small, cruel twist of the lips that conveyed everything she thought of me in that moment. It was a look of triumph, of ownership, and of utter contempt. She was showing me that she could do whatever she wanted, wherever she wanted, and I would just stand there and take it. She was holding court, displaying her conquest to the room, and my arrival was just the punchline to a joke I hadn't even realized I was the butt of. The man on her lap glanced back at me, his eyes empty and bored, offering nothing but a fleeting look of curiosity before turning his attention back to the drink in his hand. I stood there, paralyzed, as the seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. Around them, the party seemed to pause, a collective intake of breath as the other guests noticed me standing there. The silence began to ripple outward from the center of the room, people whispering to one another, eyes darting between me and the couple on the couch. I saw her best friend, the one who had texted me, standing near the kitchen island. She raised her glass to me in a mock salute, a confirmation that this had been orchestrated. This was the revelation. This was the important thing I needed to see. It wasn't a cry for help. It was an execution. The humiliation was total. I felt stripped bare, every insecurity I had ever harbored dragged out into the open and put on display for these strangers to dissect. I waited for the anger to come, the rage that would propel me across the room to smash a bottle or scream a tirade. But it didn't come. Instead, a cold, numb clarity washed over me. The fog of devotion that had clouded my vision for 3 years dissipated in an instant, leaving me with a sharp, high-definition image of reality. I saw the room for what it was, a shallow, pitiful display of ego. I saw her for what she was, a cruel, empty person who fed on the adoration of others to feel whole. And most importantly, I saw myself. I saw a man who had been willing to degrade himself for the sake of being good enough. The smirk on her face wasn't a triumph over me. It was a mask for her own hollowness. I realized then that the bet was never about her value. It was about mine. And standing there, watching her laugh at my pain, I decided that I was the only one who could cash in my chips. Turning around and walking out of that apartment was the single hardest thing I had ever done in my life. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to make a scene, to demand an explanation, to cause a scene that would shatter her perfect little party. But I knew that was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to be the crazy ex-boyfriend, the guy who couldn't handle her freedom, the validation that she was too wild to be tamed. If I yelled, if I cried, if I threw a punch, she would win. She would spin the narrative tomorrow to anyone who would listen, painting herself as the victim of an insecure man. So, I choked down the bile rising in my throat. I kept my face expressionless, turning into a mask of stone. I didn't say a word. I simply turned on my heel and walked back out the door I had just entered. The hallway was quiet again, the heavy oak door cutting off the music and the laughter as it clicked shut behind me. I leaned back against the wall for a moment, my legs trembling, struggling to draw a breath into lungs that felt seared by the oxygen in the hallway. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. I looked at my hands. They were steady, surprising me. I felt a strange detachment, as if I had just watched a movie about a terrible breakup rather than living through one. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. I walked to the elevator and pressed the down button, watching the numbers light up as the car ascended. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, catching my reflection in the polished metal walls. I looked tired, older, but I also looked like a stranger. The guy who walked into that building was gone. I walked out of the apartment complex and into the cool night air, leaving my car where it was parked. I needed to move, to feel the pavement beneath my feet, to put distance between myself and the scene of the crime. I walked aimlessly for hours, the city passing by in a blur of streetlights and shadows. I replayed the scene in my mind, the smirk, the lap, the indifference. With every block I walked, the pain receded slightly, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just leaving her. I was leaving the version of myself that allowed her to treat me that way. I was leaving the friends who enabled her, the job that drained me, and the life that was built on a foundation of sand. Eventually, I found myself at a 24-hour diner on the edge of the city. It was a greasy spoon, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt and the booths are torn. I slid into a corner seat and ordered a black coffee. I pulled out my phone and saw the missed calls and texts from her. They started as confusion. Where did you go? Why did you leave? And quickly escalated to anger. She was offended that I hadn't stayed to play my role. She was furious that I hadn't given her the reaction she craved. I read through them, one by one, and then, with a feeling of immense relief, I blocked her number. I didn't reply. I didn't explain. I just cut the cord. Sitting there, watching the steam rise from my cup, I realized that the bet my friends had spoken about was dead. They had said I couldn't do better, but they didn't know what better meant. They thought better meant a hotter girlfriend or a richer lifestyle. I knew now that better meant peace. It meant respect. It meant waking up in the morning and not having to earn the right to exist. The humiliation of the evening still stung, raw and fresh, but it was the catalyst I needed. I was free. I had lost her, but in the grand scheme of things, I hadn't lost anything of value. I had simply shed a weight I had been carrying for far too long. I sat in that diner until the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, and for the first time in 3 years, I looked forward to the day ahead. The first few weeks following the breakup were a blur of furious activity and quiet introspection. I moved out of the apartment we shared, the one where I paid the majority of the rent, almost immediately. I didn't take much, just my clothes and my books, leaving behind the furniture and the memories. I found a small one-bedroom studio across town in a building that had no doorman and no rooftop view. It was cramped and smelled faintly of old carpet, but it was mine. There were no memories of her in those walls, no shadows of her judgment hanging over the furniture. For the first time in years, I could sit on my own couch and breathe without asking for permission. I cut off everyone from that old life. The friends who had told me I was lucky to be treated like dirt were ghosted, their calls going straight to voicemail and their texts left unread. It was lonely at first. The silence in my new apartment was heavy, a constant reminder of the void she had left behind. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to feel like a blanket rather than a shroud. I started to remember who I was before her. I picked up my guitar again, an instrument that had gathered dust in the corner of her apartment because she hated the noise. I started running every morning, not to impress anyone, but to feel the strength in my legs and the clarity in my mind. At work, the change was palpable. Without the constant distraction of her drama, my focus sharpened. I threw myself into my projects, taking on extra shifts and volunteering for the difficult assignments that no one else wanted. The boss noticed. He called me into his office one Tuesday afternoon and offered me a lead position on a new campaign, a promotion that came with a significant raise and an office with a window. I accepted it with a handshake that was firm and confident. I wasn't the shy, tentative guy who apologized for his existence anymore. I was a man who knew his worth. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment I stopped trying to prove my value to someone who didn't care, my value skyrocketed in the eyes of the people who actually mattered. It was during this time of reconstruction that I met Elena. We met at a coffee shop near my office. A cliche, I know, but life has a way of writing those scripts. She was sitting at the table next to mine, struggling with a stack of architectural blueprints. I offered to help her organize them, recognizing the symbols from a project I had worked on months prior. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, missing our meetings and ignoring our phones. She was different. She listened when I spoke, her eyes focused and interested, not darting around the room to see who else was watching. She was smart, driven, and possessed a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with how many people were looking at her. We started seeing each other casually, grabbing lunch, or going for walks in the park. There was no pressure, no game playing, no hierarchy. It was just two people enjoying each other's company. She made me laugh, a genuine belly laugh that I hadn't experienced in years. With Elena, I didn't feel like I had to perform. I could be quiet, I could be silly, I could be honest. She didn't smirk at my vulnerabilities, she cherished them. She told me I was a good man, not because I bought her things, but because I was kind and thoughtful. Hearing those words from someone like her felt like water on a parched desert. I began to realize that the bet wasn't about finding the most attractive partner. It was about finding someone who saw you. And Elena saw me. She saw the guy who had been beaten down, and she was helping him build himself back up brick by brick. 6 months passed. The city had shifted from the biting cold of winter to the humid embrace of summer. I was a different man now. The constant anxiety that had been my companion for years had vanished, replaced by a steady, calm confidence. I had put on muscle from the running and the gym, and my posture had changed. I walked with my head up, making eye contact with strangers, unafraid of their judgment. My career was thriving, and my relationship with Elena was blossoming into something deep and serious. We had just returned from a weekend trip to the mountains, a trip that was defined by hiking, bad campfire coffee, and conversation that lasted until dawn. It was on a Thursday night that the past decided to collide with the present. Elena and I were attending a gallery opening for a client of mine. It was a high society event, the kind of place where people dress up in clothes that cost more than cars and drink champagne that tastes like nothing. We walked in, her hand resting gently on my arm, looking stunning in a simple black dress. The room was filled with the city's elite, a crowd I used to desperately want to be a part of when I was with her. Now, I felt indifferent. I was there for business, and more importantly, I was there with Elena. I didn't see her at first. The room was crowded, a sea of faces and voices. But then, as we were moving toward the bar, the crowd parted, and there she was. She was standing near a sculpture made of twisted metal, holding a glass of white wine, looking breathtaking in a red dress. But she looked different too. There was a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a tiredness that makeup couldn't hide. The guy from the apartment, the one from the lap, was nowhere to be seen. She was alone, looking around the room with a desperate sort of hunger, scanning for someone important. Our eyes met. The air in the room seemed to vanish. For a second, I saw a flash of shock on her face, followed quickly by a flicker of something that looked like regret, or perhaps just calculation. She started walking toward us, her hips swaying with practiced precision. I stiffened, my old instincts flaring up, the fight-or-flight response kicking in. But then I felt Elena squeeze my arm, a grounding pressure that reminded me of who I was now. I relaxed. I didn't need to run, and I didn't need to fight. She stopped in front of us, blocking our path. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the fit of my suit and the way Elena stood close to me. She opened her mouth, probably expecting me to stutter, to apologize, to look at her with the same puppy dog eyes I used to have. But I just looked at her. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I looked at her with the polite, disinterested expression one reserves for a distant acquaintance or a stranger on the subway. She faltered. The smirk was gone, replaced by confused uncertainty. She introduced herself to Elena, ignoring me completely, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that made my skin crawl. Elena, polite but perceptive, gave a curt nod. The silence stretched out, awkward and heavy. I realized then that she had no power over me anymore. She was just a woman in a red dress, standing in a room full of strangers, realizing that her audience had left the theater. I watched her struggle for something to say, the realization slowly dawning on her that the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She tried to bring up the past, mentioning a funny memory from when we were together, expecting me to jump in and finish the story. I just stared at her blankly, as if she were speaking a language I didn't understand. It wasn't an act. I genuinely couldn't access that part of my brain anymore. The memories felt like they belonged to a different person, a life I had watched in a movie years ago. Her smile faltered, the cracks in her composure widening. She looked from me to Elena, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to find a wedge, a flaw in our armor she could exploit. But there was no wedge. Elena stood beside me, calm and composed, a picture of quiet dignity. She didn't feel threatened by this woman. She saw her for what she was, a tragic figure clinging to a fading relevance. I could see the confusion in my ex's eyes. She couldn't understand why I wasn't affected. She couldn't understand why the guy she thought she owned was standing in front of her, successful and happy, without her. The narrative she had constructed in her head, the one where she was the prize and I was the lucky loser, was falling apart right in front of her. I finally broke the silence, but not to engage in a debate. I simply checked my watch, a subtle gesture that conveyed more than any shouted insult ever could. I leaned in slightly, just close enough for her to hear me over the ambient noise of the gallery. I didn't say anything mean. I didn't curse her name. I simply told her that it was good to see she was doing well, and that I hoped she found whatever she was looking for. My voice was steady, kind even, but it was the kindness one offers a stranger. It was the final nail in the coffin. By treating her with polite indifference, I was telling her that she meant nothing to me. I didn't wait for a response. I turned to Elena, a genuine smile touching my lips as I asked if she was ready to go. She nodded, and we walked away, leaving her standing there by the twisted metal sculpture. We walked out of the gallery into the cool night air, leaving the noise and the pretension behind. As we stepped onto the sidewalk, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last 6 months finally lift off my shoulders. I looked at Elena, laughing at something she was saying about the terrible art, and felt a surge of gratitude. The journey from that apartment to this sidewalk had been long and painful. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and broken, but I had also been reborn. I had learned that doing better isn't about finding someone hotter or richer. It's about finding someone who respects you, and more importantly, respecting yourself enough to walk away when they don't. The bet was settled. My friends were wrong. I could do better. In fact, by simply walking out that door and choosing myself, I already had. I squeezed Elena's hand, and we disappeared into the city lights, leaving the past where it belonged, in the dark